decisive action cross the line and become ruling by decree. We're going to unpack the actual mechanics of executive orders today. And to do that, we'll use a very specific real-world case from Nigeria to really anchor our understanding of these giant constitutional concepts. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll kick things off with that real-world case, the Oyo motorcycle ban. Then we'll define what executive orders actually are, take a look at the Nigerian constitution, dig into the whole security justification, compare primary and secondary legislation, and finally, bring it all together under the rule of law.
Section 1. The Oyo motorcycle ban, our real-world case study.
So, here are the actual facts on the ground. In Oyo State, Nigeria, Governor Seyi Makinde completely prohibited the commercial operation of motorcycles during certain hours. Now, the reason given was pressing security concerns. And it's a scenario we'd literally see all over the globe, right? A leader spots a public threat and immediately issues a rapid directive to manage it. But this kind of action naturally triggers a rather massive structural question for us.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that it forces us to shift our focus completely away from the motorcycles themselves and look at the actual constitutional stakes. Can a governor just create new legal obligations by issuing an order? Or does every single order need to trace its authority back to an established law? That right there is the core tension we're investigating today.
Section 2. Defining executive orders. What exactly are they?
Fundamentally, an executive order is just an administrative directive issued by an executive authority. But here is the absolute critical part to remember. It is not a law itself. No way. Its sole purpose is to implement existing constitutional or statutory powers. If an executive order doesn't have its roots deeply planted in the Constitution or an existing law passed by the legislature, well, it becomes incredibly vulnerable. Courts can actually strike it down as ultra-vires. That's a Latin legal term that just means beyond the powers. Basically, it means the executive stepped totally outside their legal lane.
So you might be wondering, what is an executive order actually good for then? Well, quite a lot, actually. When used properly, executives rely heavily on these orders to just run the day-to-day machinery of the government. They use them to implement existing laws, direct how government agencies operate, establish administrative procedures, coordinate enforcement, and exercise powers that a statute has explicitly handed to them. These are the completely legitimate, absolutely vital everyday functions of the executive branch. So the crucial point is understanding the hard limits of this power. An executive order absolutely cannot usurp the function of the legislature. Listen, a governor cannot just wake up one morning and decide to create a brand new criminal offense by issuing a press release. They can't impose taxes, they certainly can't abolish constitutional rights, and they definitely cannot invent entirely new legal regimes out of thin air. In a functioning democracy, making the law is the legislature's job, plain and simple, not the executive's.
Section 3. The Nigerian Constitution and the Separation of Powers.
And this brilliantly illustrates the whole concept of separation of powers. If you look at sections 4.1 and 4.6 of the Nigerian Constitution, they clearly vest the power to create the law in the assembly. On the flip side, sections 5.1 and 5.2 give the executive the power to execute the law. See the difference? The legislature creates, the executive executes. Therefore, an executive order can never, ever be used as a convenient little shortcut to avoid the hard work of actually passing real legislation.
Section 4. The security justification and emergency powers.
I want you to listen carefully to this quote straight from our source material. Security concerns do not magically convert executive power into legislative power. Now, look, security is absolutely a legitimate and paramount governmental concern. When crime spikes, citizens naturally demand action, and rightly so. But there is no hidden security exception tucked away in the Constitution that lets governors suddenly morph into lawmakers just because a situation is incredibly urgent. Good intentions simply do not replace lawful authority.
Even in the middle of a genuine emergency, the legal framework has to hold up. Under the Nigerian system, formal emergency powers are principally vested in the president, specifically under Section 305 of the Constitution. And honestly, even then, those powers are entirely subject to strict legislative oversight. Why? Because bypassing the legislature literally means bypassing the people's representatives. You have to follow the proper channels. A state governor cannot unilaterally declare that a security scare justifies going around the legislature to create new legal restrictions.
Section 5. Primary versus secondary legislation, looking at sources of authority.
Let's move to and see how this builds when we look at a parliamentary system, like over in the United Kingdom. In the UK, Parliament passes primary legislation that deliberately delegates very specific, detailed rulemaking powers to government ministers. We call this secondary legislation. Now, the minister isn't just creating law independently, they're using authority that Parliament specifically loaned to them. Well, in the Nigerian presidential system, executive orders really have to function in the exact same way. They must be firmly grounded in statutory authority passed by the legislature, not merely the personal discretion of a governor. The root of the authority always has to trace back to the legislature.
Section 6. The rule of law and democracy limits.
Now, here's the really hidden danger of executive orders. Unlike formal emergency legislation that usually has an automatic expiration date built in, executive orders rarely have sunset clauses. They just stay legally effective until they are actively revoked, replaced, struck down by a judge, or finally superseded by a new law. Think about what that actually means. A temporary restriction, maybe one that was genuinely introduced for an immediate security crisis, can quietly just drag on and become a permanent loss of liberty if the legislature doesn't step up and provide aggressive oversight.
This next quote captures the historical stakes perfectly. History teaches that governments rarely surrender powers they acquire during crises. Every single executive leader believes their immediate objectives are necessary and urgent. I mean, of course they do. But if urgency alone justified executive lawmaking, our legislatures would basically become completely irrelevant. The whole point of the separation of powers is to firmly pump the brakes on unchecked executive enthusiasm, no matter how well-meaning it might actually be.
So we're going to leave you with this final thought today. The rule of law absolutely requires every government action to trace back to lawful authority granted by the people's representatives. That is exactly what separates a constitutional government from a government by decree. So as you evaluate the actions of leaders navigating security issues and crises, ask yourself this. No matter how pressing the challenge is, should government by decree ever be allowed to become the rule rather than the strictest of exceptions? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.